Kathy, it is so great to spend a little bit of time with you. We caught up a few months ago. I got to hear about the amazing work you're doing, about your new book that's coming out. And so just really thrilled for the opportunity to spend some time today hearing some updates and in particular, digging in a bit more about your book.
Thank you, David. It's so nice to see you too. And you've been busy as well, for sure. So, two people
It's
very focused on letting the world know what's going on in oncology. So, it's a good thing.
It's been busy. Two people who have shared passions for helping people going through tough times. And we also, I guess, have one other thing in common. I saw that Katie Kirk wrote the foreword for your book. I'd love to hear a little bit about your relationship with Katie. I got a chance to spend some time with her a bit over the last year and would love to hear about, you and your time with Katie.
Katie is amazing. I first met Katie. I was a fan of the Today Show and a fan of Katie.
All of
But
us are, right?
ironically, and I kept watching, in the morning before work. But her husband was diagnosed, Jay, right after me. And so I kept following her, on the Today Show. And I just had so much admiration for her relationship with him, how she took care of him. And so I think I became like a super fan. So ironically, we ended up meeting at a funeral for David Bloom. And because I'd been such a fan, David, I felt like I knew her. She didn't know me, but I felt like I knew her. And so I approached her at the funeral and we just started talking and we became very fast friends after that.
Oh, it's amazing. And she's incredible, isn't she?
She's awesome.
Well, so tell us a little bit more about your story. So you shared that Katie's husband was diagnosed around the time that you're diagnosed. Maybe take us through your journey, which, as I know, it has been multiple journeys. But maybe to start, take us through your journey with cancer and your plural.
Sure, I'll give you the short version, but I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma when I was 37 years old. And this was back in 1996. So, David, you can imagine no internet or anything back then. And when I was diagnosed, I remember trying to understand something about the disease and running to Borders bookstore and picking up Harrison's Internal Medicine and the Merck manual. I mean, fortunately, I knew a little bit about healthcare and kept reading and thinking, oh my God, this is a tough one. The odds of living more than 3 years were dismally low. So it was, it's one thing I think to get diagnosed with cancer. It's another one to get diagnosed with one of the really fatal ones like myeloma. So I had been working in the pharmaceutical industry at the time, and I basically had to take a leave of absence and focus on what I was going to do with my disease. And that meant I was taking some time off to get second, third, fourth opinions and all of that. And over time, I decided to start a research foundation. I did it pretty quickly within a year or two of my diagnosis. And that was the start of the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. And really, David, I did it because I kept thinking, why are there no drugs in the pipeline at all for this, fatal disease? And it was just so incredibly neglected. So by raising money and bringing the research community together and attracting them to the field of myeloma, we were able to get the MMRF off the ground as a foundation, and we were able to start funding research. And then you kind of know how it works when you're living in the business world. Your mind always goes to, what is the strategy to solve the problem for this disease? And my mind kept going there. And as a patient, I was seeing firsthand some of the things I needed to do. Like, okay, we don't have any tissue on this disease to understand the biology of the disease. So at the MMRF, we ended up building a tissue bank. Once we were doing that, genomic sequencing was starting to come into play, just starting. So we became the first to sequence the myeloma genome. We built a clinical network that is now done over 100 phase 1 and 2 trials in myeloma. And again, we've done huge amounts of data sharing so that we could all understand much more about the disease. But fast forward, myeloma now has over 15 drugs approved, and patients are living 3 times longer than they were before. And it's just a huge success story. And I think one that I hope every cancer and rare disease gets to experience at some point in time. But it takes a lot of leadership and a lot of collaboration and teamwork to get there.
Oh, wow. Well, thanks so much for sharing that. For anyone who's listening or watching, the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation is just truly the pinnacle in terms of organizations that have gone from, as you described, a disease where there was nothing to a disease where there are so many treatments, and it's just so incredible. But in your personal journey, that's not really where it ended, right? It wasn't you were diagnosed with myeloma, and then you started the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation and really changed that disease fundamentally. Something else happened more recently, and maybe you can share a bit more about that.
Yeah, after battling myeloma, and I ended up doing quite well, partly because of the success of the MMRF. My induction therapy was, Revlimid, Velcade. And it ended up being super helpful for me. And I did a stem cell transplant with my identical twin sister. So I felt very fortunate in moving in that direction. And I ended up thinking, okay, I'm actually maybe going to beat this disease or live with it for a really long time. And then it was just a year and a half ago that I was diagnosed with breast cancer. But, David, it was early stage. I was very fortunate, and I kind of tell the story in the book that I was sitting at one of the meetings on the Obama Precision Medicine project, and one of the docs from myeloma said to me, I know your twin sister was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. I hope you're seeing a breast surgeon and, being watched carefully. And I was not. At the time, I was not. And so he was like, you need to move and you need to get screened because now you're considered high risk. And the risk wasn't just that my identical twin had breast cancer. It was because I'd had radiation to my ribs for the multiple myeloma, and that puts you at yet another high risk. So because I was monitored so carefully, they found it early. I will say, now that I've had both a hematologic malignancy or a blood cancer and a solid tumor, I feel like I'm covering both fields. The big problem on the solid tumor was high infection rate. I mean, I ended up with 4 different surgeries. And part of the problem I really should have known, and I always say this to patients, like, don't be concerned if you don't know all the answers, because people like you and I have studied this like crazy and we can still get things wrong. But it turned out that age, an immune system from a stem cell transplant, expanders all really increase the infection rate. And I should have been much more careful, to be honest with you.
Wow. Well, I'm glad that you're doing so well now. You look great, and and you've got some exciting news on the horizon. A new book coming out in a month's time. Maybe you could share with us a little bit about your book and why you decided to write it.
So over the last 18 months, I started writing, and the book is called Fatal to Fearless: 12 Steps to Beating Cancer in a Broken Medical System. And I wrote it because over the last number of years, I think I have coached thousands of cancer patients. And David, you get this, I'm sure, all the time too. People want to know, how do you maneuver around a very challenging broken system? And what I would find is, when the patients were on the phone with me, at the end of just 15 minutes, they would say, Kathy, 15 minutes with you just saved me 5 months of aggravation. I now understand things so much better. And because I understand them better, I have more hope and I'm feeling much more calm. We do a point where it would be like, just hearing your voice brings me calm. And so I think trying to spend time making sense of the system for patients who had never been in it before was something I felt an obligation to do. Because doing one-on-one phone calls is not a sustainable model to help everybody. And so I wrote the book as here are the 12 steps. And I did it based off of, no matter who I was coaching, I would always ask the same questions. And I'd always say, now these are the things you need to be asking your doctor. And I just took these steps from diagnosis to being in treatment to when you're in remission or stable disease. But David, the interesting thing about writing the book was I had to go back and kind of study my life from the day I was diagnosed with myeloma. So I pulled out the first journal I'd written for our daughter, Nicole, who was only 18 months old at the time. And I opened it up and out came cards I'd written for her, an ultrasound, all the little things that I had tucked in there. And then I read 26 journals for 26 years I never expected to live while I was writing the book. And I have to be honest with you, I read through all those journals thinking oh, I'm going to read and say, I got it right. I was amazing. And I made all the right decisions. And I really didn't. I read those journals and thought to myself, wow, this disease and cancer really takes a toll on everybody around us. And it takes a toll on the patient, but it really takes a toll on the caregivers, the family, the friends, that support you. And the longer we live, it's a long time to be dealing with illness and disease. And so I think it's really important for us as patients and also for caregivers to know there's a lot we can do to improve the relationship and to make sure that everybody stays safe and sound.
Wow, it's such important advice. Any particular messages you would share with the loved ones of patients in terms
Yeah.
of, you've got someone you care about, newly diagnosed with cancer, and it sounds like there's a clear handbook now that's going to be coming out from you on, how do you deal with it? What about the loved ones? Any specific advice you'd share with a loved one of someone who has
Yes,
a
definitely.
cancer?
Because, you know, typically there's 2 million cancer survivors every year. There's 3 to 5 million that become caregivers, that have caregivers. And when they've done the studies, what they're finding is when cancer patients are, especially in the thick of treatment, caregivers are spending 32 hours taking care of their loved one. And, what's going on around them is they're nervous about their jobs, they're nervous about their productivity, and there's just so much on their minds, and they don't want to say anything because, their loved one has cancer. So the advice I give is it's really important for the patient to understand their needs and their wants and to write them down and to make sure that they're not solely relying on one caregiver. If you can find other people to help you along the way, it's critical. If you can talk to the disease foundations and the hospital and understand what other resources might be available to you, that is critical too, because just relying on that one person isn't fair to them. And then I always say to the caregiver on the other side, you have to speak up. You have to say, this is taking a toll on me. Like when I was reading the book, I went back and I thought to myself, from the moment I was diagnosed, and it was so fatal at that time, like we knew I had 3 years to live. That's all it was. And so the immediate reaction was for us to move east near family. And that meant my husband was selling a company that he had worked really hard to build. And when you start off and that's the first thing you're doing, and then life goes on and there's just so many other sacrifices that people are making, they need to speak up and say, you know, there are certain things I just really want to do. And the patient needs to be saying, okay, this is what I need and this is what I can handle. And that honest discussion is really hard to do for some people.
Yeah, and it's such an important discussion to have. So in your book, you talk a lot about hope, and you and I have spoken about the power of hope in the past. Maybe tell me a little about what hope means to you, and maybe are there different kinds of hope? Just interested to hear you share a bit more about your feelings about hope.
So I feel like there's no better time than now to be hopeful because I feel like the entire world of science is mind blowing. When I was first diagnosed, David, like I could look at the pipeline, there was nothing there. And back then it was like it takes 10 years to get a drug to market. It's going to cost $1 billion. So there was no hope. I was thinking, there's just no way we're going to find something to buy me time. In today's world where we're seeing so much work on diagnostics, so much work in targeted therapies, so much work in immunotherapies, all of these fields are growing so fast that you have to say to yourself, the science is amazing. A lot can happen in a year. And as a patient and or a caregiver, you have to stay on top of that science to make sure you don't miss any opportunities. So to me, the hope is science is moving fast, and the need is you got to stay on your game and know where to look for the discoveries.
And it's moving fast, which is great for us, but it's not moving so fast that we can sort of sit around and hope that it's all going to happen in front of us. To your point, we need to be proactive. We need to, as you know, the subtitle of my book is Doctor's Race to Turn Hope into Action. And it's this
Yeah.
idea that, okay, we've got this great hope. To your point, drugs come down the pipeline, but let's make sure that we're going to the experts. Let's make sure that we're giving our blood sample for research. Let's make sure that
Yes.
we're doing the things we can so that we can turn this hope into action and also turn it into permanent cures.
It's so true. In the book, I talk about the red igloo cooler, David, where it dawned on me when I was, at Dana-Farber and I'm doing a bone marrow biopsy and the scientists are right outside the door of the red igloo cooler. And I'm like,
Yep.
what are they doing? And my doctor said they're taking the sample and running it upstairs, while the cells are live and it's a Friday and, they're going to be working all weekend on this. And at that point, you realize your tissue is gold and it's precious. Yeah. And it's really important to the scientific community to be able to work with it. And so is your data. And so is it when you raise your hand for a clinical trial. And so is it when you support a foundation that's working in the field and you become a mentor or you run a race. Whatever it is that's going to make you feel better, the most important thing you can do is get involved.
I love that. And, you and I both have benefited from the work that we've been a part of. We've seen other patients benefit. And when I say benefit, I mean, health, life extension. But I also think that there's this incredible psychological benefit of getting involved, being proactive in the midst of a really tough time. My mom used to talk about we shouldn't just look for silver linings, we should look to create silver linings. So when
Yes.
things are bad, when times are tough, that's when we need to start doing things to create something positive out of really difficult situations. And obviously you're like the poster child of, of creating silver linings, right? I mean, imagine if when you were diagnosed with myeloma, you just sort of sat and waited around and said, I really hope something positive comes from this. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing and just sort of, let's hope something positive comes. But instead you said, I'm going to create MMRF and I'm going to create something positive about this. So Kathy, I'd love to ask you a little bit about, as you know, drug repurposing is an incredible passion of mine, and of course I'm alive thanks to Repurpose Drug. Would love to ask you about one of my favorite repurposed drugs, and that's thalidomide. So could
Yes.
you sort of tell us, the viewers, the listeners, a bit about thalidomide and the history of it before myeloma, in myeloma? So I'd love to hear, directly from you about thalidomide.
It was such an interesting time because I had honestly just started the foundation and we were still young. And all of a sudden, the scuttlebutt started coming through from the scientists talking. And again, I'm running a foundation, so I'm talking to the scientists all the time and I'm listening in on this. And of course, it turns out that the thalidomide, which, was based off of an angiogenesis topic, and people thinking, well, if that actually is working, then could the thalidomide work in cancer? And it was actually the wife of a patient who was studying the abstracts and reading the research. And she said, couldn't this drug potentially work? And so she asked Bart Barlegee at the University of Arkansas to try the thalidomide on her husband. They did. It did not work on him. He was too far along. But for the next patient, the thalidomide did work. And so the fact that they were able to do this and pull this off was kind of mind blowing. But again, remember, myeloma was so fatal that we were always looking for new ideas. And I think there was a fair amount of risk taking to go on. And so all of a sudden, the trials started to emerge and saying, okay, there's something to this drug. Up until that time, David, at the MMR, a lot of our work had been doing vaccine technology. We were doing dendritic vaccine, DNA vaccine, and of course, stem cell transplant, but we were working on novel drugs. So when thalidomide emerged and it started to show promise, it changed the whole focus of the MMRF back over to novel drugs and targeted therapies and clinical trials, a space that I felt really comfortable having come from the pharmaceutical industry. So we were really able to work as a community to start focusing on that. The other interesting thing about the thalidomide story is for Celgene, because the drug was not approved yet, it was really hard to let everybody know what was going on with the trials. But as a patient-focused foundation, we were able to communicate directly with the patients to at least let them know where trials were going on. And we were doing it through a newsletter and things like that. And I think that helped us to get trials enrolled and to start supporting the thalidomide, which had such a terrible reputation, but was bringing a new life to cancer patients.
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah. And you mentioned a terrible reputation. For listeners, thalidomide was initially utilized as a drug for morning sickness. The thought was that it would be an anti-nausea drug introduced in Europe in the 50s. And shortly after it was first introduced, thousands of children were born without limbs. And it was quickly taken off the market in the US and in Europe. But unfortunately, literally thousands of children were born without limbs. And research was done to try to understand why did thalidomide do this. And as Kathy mentioned earlier, it works by preventing blood vessel growth or angiogenesis. And what became clear was that you need blood vessel growth and angiogenesis for your limbs to form, for your arms and legs to form. And so if you take thalidomide or if you're exposed to it while you're in utero, those blood vessel developments that are important for limb formation, it doesn't occur. And so To your point, work was done later on to then say, well, cancer also really needs blood vessels, and cancer really also needs angiogenesis to thrive. So what if we think about using a drug like thalidomide to cut off some of that blood supply? And of course, as you shared, it demonstrated its effectiveness in myeloma. It also is being studied in parallel for leprosy. It got FDA approval for leprosy,
Yeah.
and of course got FDA approval for myeloma. And so it's just one of my favorite drugs, because we often think about drugs as being for the disease that they're first approved for. So we'll call a drug a diabetes drug. But the reality is the drug is not a diabetes drug. It's a drug that works on a pathway and has a mechanism that should alleviate diabetes, just like this drug. It's not a leprosy drug. It's not a myeloma drug. It's not an anti-nausea drug. It's just a really powerful drug that has a lot of effects, and it's our I guess it's our responsibility as a human race to figure out all the effects of these drugs. And so thalidomide is just absolutely one of my favorite ones. And I love to hear that you were involved in that, and also love that you mentioned you took Revlimid, which is a second generation version of thalidomide yourself. And that I'm so glad that it's been so helpful for you.
Yeah, I mean, kudos to Celgene. They did move quickly with thalidomide, then onto the next generation Revlimid, and then on to Pomalyst as well. So the myeloma community ended up with 3 incredible compounds based off of that mechanism of action, which was amazing.
It really is. Speaking of businesses, would love for you to share a little bit about the business of medicine and the system that we're in. You mentioned the power of a company like Celgene to advance 3 life-changing therapies for myeloma. I know in your book you also talk about how the system's broken in many ways. Would maybe just be interested to hear your thoughts on the business of medicine and the system that we're all working within.
Yeah, I think when you look at the business of medicine, and as you know, I was up at Harvard Business School for 5 years under, a grant from Robert Kraft. And at that point, I brought all the different foundations and the medical community together just to talk about the challenges we had and the system itself overall. And at the end of the day, I think the problem is, and it's a very hard problem to solve, is, at Harvard Business School, you always say, follow the money, follow the incentives, and you'll start to understand what the challenges are. And unfortunately, in healthcare, the incentives aren't aligned. The system is so vast, and the incentives for academia are different. I mean, publish or perish versus pharmaceutical companies, which have their shareholders. And so you've got to understand, how does it all work? The problem for the patient is, because it is so vast and fragmented, the integration of it is left in the patient's hands. So if you think about, David, like when you're diagnosed and you've never been in the medical community, so put us aside, and now you're facing, okay, you've got to get from the medical oncologist to the surgical oncologist to the pathologist to the radiation oncologist, and you're moving all over. And that's just getting you into the doctor's office. Never mind, you're dealing with the insurance issues, then infusion rooms and everything else. And so the burden of that integration on the patient is incredibly intense and overwhelming for them. So that's a huge issue. The second issue is one that we just talked about, which is, in today's world, the science is moving so fast, but on average, oncologists have 16 minutes to spend with their cancer patients. And so here you are with, a potentially fatal disease that you're really scared of. You've probably done your own little bit of research, but all you know is there's different things out there, and you don't know what's right for you. And you've got 16 minutes with your doctor to help you through this. That's not fair to the doctor, and it's not fair to the patient. As a result, the patient often relies on their caregiver. They bring somebody with them. And now the caregiver feels responsible for understanding it too, and it takes a toll on everybody. These are complex decisions where you need help. And I think the third one is just the concern of financial toxicity. In today's world of oncology, these out-of-pocket costs can be astronomical. So 1 in 3 cancer patients either have to borrow from a family member, go into their savings, or go bankrupt. And that's really stressful for the patient and their family around them. So all these things they're solved, in the short term by patients knowing there are resources available to them at the hospitals, at the research foundations, other places. There are navigators, there are mentors, there are other people, and using those resources. But, we've got to do a heck of a lot better at being able to change the system overall.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And one other area that I think about and talk about a lot is around the fact that when a drug becomes FDA approved, and certainly once it becomes generic, which 80% of all of our FDA approved drugs are already generic, there's no more incentives left to try to find more uses for those drugs. So you think about a drug like thalidomide, now that it's off patent, although it is a bit unusual, as you know, there were patents taken out on thalidomide, basically for how it's monitored from a safety perspective. So it actually still has more patent life than most other drugs would. But let's take a drug like thalidomide, say it's off patent. Even if there's great researchers finding more uses for those drugs, no drug companies will work to get new indications added to the drug. So there are all these opportunities. 80% of drugs within reach that are approved, where there are no incentives to figure out more uses for them, which, as you know, you and I have discussed. This is why we launched EveryCure, to try to create a system to systematically identify new uses for existing medicines, because in the same way that you talked about financial toxicity, if a patient can't afford medicine, they can't take it. And if our system doesn't incentivize matching drugs to diseases, then those patients with those diseases aren't going to be able to benefit from that medication, even though it's literally within reach. It's literally at the neighborhood CVS. And so obviously that's something that I'm really passionate about. Interested, of course we talked about thalidomide, but interested to hear any other experiences that you've had with repurposing. I know that rituximab has been utilized in myeloma. Velcade has been utilized in a number of other conditions outside of myeloma. Just sort of interested, dexamethasone's like the ultimate repurposed drug, right? You guys use dex in myeloma and just about everything else. But any other sort of insights or experiences with repurposing from your journeys?
I feel like in myeloma, just like in so many of the blood cancers are they're so far ahead. And part of the reason that people really started studying in myeloma is they could follow the patients just by following a biomarker in our blood. While it's tricky to do a bone marrow biopsy, it's not as hard as going in and collecting actual patient tissue from a lung or other places. So from that standpoint, we were able to move drugs through the myeloma space pretty quickly because we could get the clinical trials done because we had a great biomarker, and we used that to be highly effective. But as all the new drugs became available in myeloma, then of course they were moved out toward other blood cancers and other diseases. But I feel like it's also the same thing that's going to happen in terms of where we go with immunotherapy and other fields like that. Because again, blood cancers are leading the way in that space. And so now where we are is, okay, what are we going to do with CAR T? What are we going to do in this field? How do we diminish the toxicities? And I still feel like we're going to learn, based off of some of the basic science in translational medicine, how those drugs can be used. So it's not just on the multi-purpose, but it's also on leading the way in the technology and then letting all the other cancers learn from that, especially if you can get the samples and understand how these drugs are actually working and what that means for other diseases. But exactly. I think it's the most important thing we can all do. And it's why, I love talking to people like you, because for all of us that care about science and business, your mind takes you to a certain place, which is in these rare diseases, you see a huge gaping hole, which is also an incredibly large opportunity. And I saw the same thing. I'm like, okay, well, I work in the pharmaceutical industry. There is a biomarker. This has high unmet need in myeloma. The FDA will help us. Like, there were certain things that were positives about the disease that thalidomide just jump-started for us. And I feel like this is where you shine too. It's like you're sitting there and saying, there are these drugs available, the incentives are not aligned, but there's probably a way to fix it. And I feel like that we're all trying to take pieces of this broken healthcare system and fix them for the diseases that we know about. But God, it would be so much nicer if we could actually change the whole darn system.
I love it. I love it. And I couldn't agree more. So you mentioned Little Rock, Arkansas, and Bart Barloggia. I'm just interested, Kathy, did you ever visit Bart in Little Rock? Have you ever spent any time at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences? And if so, would love to hear if you have any good stories from your time in Little Rock or with Bart. Sorry I didn't warn you I was going to ask you this.
I will tell you, I went on the road with my husband when I was first diagnosed and people found out I had an identical twin. You can imagine that a lot of people wanted to meet me because I'm young, I'm otherwise healthy, I'm a great transplant candidate, and I have an identical twin. That's like fascinating research.
Yes.
Like it's like hitting the trifecta there. And so I did make the rounds with my husband going, I mean, back then Seattle was a huge transplant center, Dana-Farber, New York, Mayo Clinic. So I mean, I literally had to go on a road trip and try to meet everybody. So I did go to BART and I did go to Arkansas. And I've always said that I appreciated Bart because, he was a bit of a rebel and he was always looking for new ideas. And I think every community needs something like that. I can't tell you that I was comfortable doing my transplant in Arkansas, but it wasn't because of Bart. I just, was having two young children at that point, and I wanted to be close to home, which led me to Boston. But I think every disease benefits from different types of personalities and clinicians and researchers in the field. I think where diseases really benefit is when people like you enter the fold, or me, and we host those meetings and they remember that a patient is in the room and that the job is to be honest and say what they really think and feel. They don't need to be polite. Academia can be incredibly polite to each other. Say what you're really thinking, and let's not waste time, and let's find the right types of projects and programs, fund them, and get them done.
Yeah, let's focus on helping patients. Let's forget about
Yeah.
authorship order. Let's forget about grants and
Right.
tenure. Let's just focus on patient impact. I totally agree. I'll just share a quick Bart Barloghi story, and that's that. So when I was sick and diagnosed with Castleman disease, Little Rock, Arkansas, UAMS is the epicenter. It's the mecca for Castleman's. And so in between relapses, my dad and I went out there, and I had spent months in the ICU at University of Pennsylvania, at Duke University, at a number of other hospitals, and they couldn't diagnose me. I mean, the best centers in the world, and of course I love Penn, I work here, and I think of it as the best, one of the best centers in the world, couldn't diagnose Castleman's. I got to Little Rock, Arkansas, and I took a shuttle from the airport to my hotel, and I got on the shuttle, and the shuttle driver looked at me and said, "Do you have Castleman disease?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I do." He's like, "Oh yeah, you look sort of like a Castleman's patient. We have a lot of Castleman patients coming in." I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, "Wait a minute, I can't get diagnosed at the best medical centers in the world when they're running
Yes.
tests on me." And this bus driver looks at me and it could tell right away I had Castleman's. But that
I've
was
never heard that story. That's amazing.
yeah, and it's because because it's the epicenter. I think it gets to one of the things that you share in your lessons, and that's
Yeah.
go to the places that are the experience centers, because even the bus
Absolutely.
driver, can make a diagnosis in these places. And so I get to Little Rock. I ended up relapsing while I was there, and got admitted to the ICU. Ended up receiving a bunch of chemotherapy, and I just started to improve. And I'd heard all about Dr. Barloghi from one of his colleagues who was treating me. I was sort of finally becoming aware of things, sort of getting out of a fairly comatose state I'd been in for weeks. And in the room walks this gentleman who's in sort of like head to toe leather motorcycle outfit with like a leather hat on top. And he's got these red sunglasses. And he walks into the room, and I smell cigarette smoke, and I'm sort of like, I'm sort of like I said, very confused. I'm like, who is this? And it's like, this is Bart Barloghi, the literal, leading maverick in all of myeloma, and just like not what I was expecting at all, right? But
And that's how he dressed for every medical meeting. Like, that's just how he would show up. And everybody else, coat, especially back then, coat,
Totally.
tie, the whole thing, and in would come Bart. But you know what? Different people with different points of view and different ideas, that's what you need in a room to find a cure.
It is, and you think about risk profiles too, right? And he's coming in with his motorcycle helmet on, having smoked cigarettes. These are two very risky behaviors, but he was the kind of guy, and he is the kind of guy that takes these huge risks. And
Yes.
And one comment I'll make, which you'll know much better than I will, but that's around Bart had some really wild ideas about how to treat myeloma early on, and his philosophy was many centers are using one drug or another drug at a time. I'm going to use all the drugs at once. I'm going to give maximum possible dose. I'm going to call it total therapy.
Yep.
Total therapy 1, I think they're on to total therapy 14 or something like that now. But everyone said this is crazy. This lunatic is going to harm his patients by giving them all the drugs at the highest possible dose. And then he started showing the results, and the survival curves were incredible. Patients were living longer if they received his what seemed like almost crazy treatment approaches. And so, to your point, it takes those sorts of out of the box thinkers
Mhm.
who maybe have different risk profiles than some of us to really take these sorts of big bets that would then result in many, many lives being saved.
Absolutely. And where he really was, you need the depth of response. And that has become true in myeloma. The deeper the response and the more you can get to minimal residual disease, the better off you're going to be. So his philosophy was not wrong. And people,
Exactly.
oh, that's a lot to put the patient through. But for the patient, that's up to the patient. Can I get through it? And, so how long can I live as a result of that? So it's always a balance. And at the end of the day, it comes back to what's the best thing for the patient.
I totally agree with you. So, Kathy, just I wanted to round out with a couple last few questions. So, I know from following you on social that you have at least one daughter. Is that right? Do you have any other children? Is that right,
I have one
Kathy?
daughter and one son. I had my
One
son
daughter, one
after
son.
I got diagnosed.
With
Yes.
myeloma. Wow, it's
Yeah,
amazing.
and that is, David, why like I write in the book that um you'll never have a time like you and I had where you you know you're going to die. Like people have told you you're going to die and you believe it because there's nothing out there to save you. So I started writing to our daughter when she was 18 months old. I was writing a journal to her just because I wanted her to remember me. That was why I was writing. But the more I was writing, I kept saying how much I wished that she had a brother or a sister. And we found my myeloma while we were trying to get to a fertility doctor. And so people thought I was crazy, just absolutely crazy, pursuing, IVF and things like that while I was battling myeloma. But it was my true want was to build our family. And there's something that happens when you face a fatal disease, which is you're not focused on yourself because you're going to be dead. You're focused on those that you're leaving behind. And so I was very focused on my husband, who was a great dad, and our daughter. And I'd always had an identical twin. And so David was born in 1997. I mean, I was diagnosed in 96. He was born in 1997. And I always say I've never had a sad day since. Like that was my huge one. And they are the best of friends. I see you on social with your kids,
Yeah.
and I'm always smiling because it's like for people like us, we know how important it is. And we like anything we're watching with them is just a moment that we sit and go, I can't believe I just saw that.
It's amazing. It makes you appreciate life and
Yeah.
everything about life. For me, and just last night I was setting the table for dinner, and I was just like thinking about the joy of being able to like set the table.
Yeah.
And it brought me back to I remember when I first got out of the hospital after spending about 6 months hospitalized, and it was that my first night after I was like setting the table, and I was just thinking to myself, I'm like, this is so great. Like I'm out of the hospital. I'm setting the table. We're gonna have dinner with my family, with the people you love. And it was like, trust me, I was never like thrilled to set the table
Right.
before I got sick. But just like the littlest things become so special. Well, the reason I asked about your kids is I really enjoy hearing people tell me about hypothetically if there were three traits that they would want to have their kids exemplify, what would those three traits be? And in your case, you can sort of describe what they would be and maybe what they are, and hopefully there's some nice overlap. But what are the let's take you back to 1997.
Mhm.
What are the three things that you want? What are the three traits you want your kids to have?
So I think the first one is for them to watch, and when you use the word hopeful, to know that with hard work, dreams can come true. Like, I wrote the first sentence I wrote in my journal was, I'm never going to see you to kindergarten. Like, I would do anything to see you to kindergarten, Nicole. And, now, I've seen her college, business school, you name it. We've been to every graduation possible, and same for David. And so I think for them, I'm always just trying to say to them, your dreams will come true if you stay focused and you work really, really hard on them. I think the second thing I always try to focus on is just be curious. I feel like I'm always like one of the things about me is I never sit still. I'm always trying to learn something new. And so people always say, like, oh, you went from, let's run the MMR to, oh, let's go teach this up at Harvard Business School to, oh, I think I need to write a book. And like you and I have talked, I don't know anything about writing a book. Nothing about writing a book. And it's scary, but yeah, but I was kind of like, okay, well, if I talk to enough people and I have enough friends, they'll help me figure out how to write a book and I'll get that done. So I feel like that next part is the curious. I will tell you though, the third part that I learned from writing the book, because it did make me go back and read all the journals. The third part was the importance of relationships and those that love you, whether they're your family or your closest friends. Like when I was running the foundation, I'm sure it's like this too. I've seen some of your travel schedules, David, but between fundraising, getting programs done, doing all the things you need to do, they're 60, 70. These are long weeks that you're away from your family, and they're making so many sacrifices. And so when I kept reading, I was like, wow, I gave up a lot, and I probably would have tried to take some of that back because, the relationship side is so important that I would probably advise them, like, make sure you're really focused on sticking with those that love you and giving them the time that you need to give them.
Well, I love that. I mean, what you've sort of blended together are the things that you've done in your life that you're really happy with, and maybe the things in your life that you'd have done a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of what life is about. It's about learning from the highs and the lows, and
Yeah.
the successes and the not so successes. For me, the three that I think about, I have a 5-year-old daughter and a 2-year-old son.
Yeah.
My three, the first I think is kindness. I think that
Yeah.
we just need to treat one another in this world in a kind way. The second is honesty. I think that there's honesty is the foundation upon which upon which relationships are formed. It sort of puts us all on a level playing field, knowing that you're going to get exactly what you're sharing. And the third one for me is hardworking. Is just
Yeah.
no matter what my kids achieve in their lives or do in their lives, knowing that they're putting that full effort in is important to me. And of course, that means that here I am, with my 5-year-old and my 2-year-old, and I'm like, watching the way that, are they being kind? Are they being honest to one another? Are they working hard on their projects that they're doing with, finger painting? But
Yes.
it's already, it's already, apparent that, start to see these things even really early in their lives.
It's so true. Yeah.
Well, Kathy, I just want to sort of wrap things up by asking if there are any things on your mind, things that we didn't cover, questions that you maybe would want to touch on, or anything that we didn't hit yet.
I think the most important thing I want people to know is, again, going back to the fact that the science is moving fast. I mean, you and I wish it would move even faster, but the progress keeps going faster and faster. And so the most important thing I encourage is for every patient and whoever loves that patient to make sure you do stay on your game and know that if you do, you might buy yourself some very precious time, which would buy you more time with your family. And so I feel like for people like you and me, you're often balancing this saving your life, which when you become ill, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to save your life while you're living it. And that balance can seem hard, but there are resources available to help you.
And now there's an amazing resource with your book. I am so excited for the world to have that resource. I'm so excited for individuals going through really tough times to be able to reach out for it. I mean, something that we've spoken about earlier, and I think about a lot is sometimes we can just want our doctors to give us all the answers and say, look, I'm just going to go to the first doctor who I trust and I love, give me all the answers, and I'm not going to think about my disease. I'm just going to follow. And I think that's sort of what we all want, right? Like we would all love this world where like the first doctor you go to will have all the answers and you can live your life while dealing with all this other stuff. But I think the important message that you're sharing, and something that I've really tried to harp on, is that I wouldn't be alive if that was the approach I took. You wouldn't be alive if that was the approach you took, and many other people, of course, wouldn't. And so to really not to put pressure on ourselves to have to create foundations or to repurpose drugs on ourselves, but it's to say that we have the opportunity, because of all the great work that's already being done, to seek those resources out, to go to the right centers, to talk to the right foundations. And I'm so glad that you're sharing this book to emphasize how powerful each of us can be in our own fights. It's not just that we're sort of going to get dragged along, but we really can be a part of this. Well, any closing thoughts or comments? And of course, I'd love for you to share where readers could go to get copies of your book and to follow the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so you can absolutely buy the book anywhere where you buy books. So, and it's available now for pre-sale. And then the other important piece, David, is that, of course, I want everybody to buy the book. It's a wonderful companion. I feel like, when you get diagnosed with something, to read a book where somebody has been through it and they get you is a lovely companion. But not everybody can buy a book. So the 12 steps are also on my website at kathygiusti.com, because it's really important to people like you and me that any information we have is available to any and all patients. So I encourage anybody to go pick up the steps too on my website.
I love that, and I'm sure that they could find your social handles on kathygiusti.com as
Yes.
well, and follow your social posts just like I love them. Well, Kathy, this has been so special. Thanks so much for taking some time to catch up and to share more about your book and all the great work you're doing.
Thank you, David. Right back at you.